on my right or my left, I can't actually work out, is the wonderful Phil Bell from Zip. Hello, Phil.
Hey guys, how you going?
They're all well, and we're all well. Thank you very much in our bubbles. And we thought that these series of webinars, as I said, the fifth one now, is a really good way to still keep engaged with people that, like you, are unable to get to their projects. So you got that happening, of course, with you too. Are you longing to get back out in the field?
Yeah, totally. So our big field site down on the west coast is in full lockdown, like everyone else. So we're eagerly awaiting primarily the Department of Conservation's permission to get back in there and see what we're dealing with.
Fantastic. Before we start on the presentation, it'd be good to get a bit of history of where you came from to be in that position that you are now with Zip.
Yeah. So I've grown up in conservation. My dad, Brian, was in the Wildlife Service before it became the Department of Conservation. And so he was exceptional at blurring the work-life balance line. And so our school holidays were spent doing conservation work all over the place. So my normal is conservation. My happy space is eradication work. And so when the opportunity came in the Department of Conservation to start working on a program of work that would look at how might we do predator control differently, I jumped at the chance, and then here we are 5 or so years later, and we've spun out into Zip.
Lovely photo. Where's that wonderful photo? And let's begin.
Yeah, so that photo is from our west coast site down in the Perth Valley in South Westland. I just thought I'd quickly start by very briefly explaining Zip. So Zero Invasive Predators, we were set up about 5 years ago as a partnership between the Department of Conservation and the Next Foundation. We are a non-profit charitable company, which is a kind of a weird mix. I can explain some of that later if people have burning questions on it. But the key piece I kind of want to highlight was what we're trying to do is the research and development. We're not setting ourselves up in any way to be the delivery agent. We're kind of all about figuring out what we can do to get rid of rats, stoats and possums from landscapes in the New Zealand mainland, and then protect those sites from reinvasion again. And so it's that protection piece that I'm going to talk about today. When Beck and Jesse got in touch with me about this presentation idea, the key piece of feedback that I'd received was that people were interested in what are the kind of researchers and developers up to. And there's a whole swag of that stuff. And so I decided I'd hang out at least around some of that protection stuff to kind of give you guys a general theme about where some of that's going around. Once you've got rid of predators from a place, what's some ideas that are starting to be formed about how do we protect those and lock in the gains? So, this won't be news to a lot of people, but barriers to invasion, they come in kind of all shapes and sizes. Traditionally, for predator-free sites in New Zealand, they've either been islands surrounded by the sea, which is a pretty good barrier in itself, or the really clever tech of predator fencing. So, we've now got many sanctuaries, including Zealandia here in Wellington, that are sensational success stories based around the technology of fencing that can exclude these predators and effectively create islands on the mainland. Some of the work that we've started looking at really early on in Zip was the idea of a virtual barrier. So how good is a whole line of traps really closely together and repeated lines at slowing down that invasion rate so that you can have your island in behind that, potentially in landscapes where fencing isn't as desirable for whatever reason. So the picture I just put up there is a little bit of design thinking we did with the Predator Free Wellington team around how we might create a virtual barrier across that neck of peninsula before you get to the Wellington Airport and the Miramar Peninsula. And then in more recent times, we've been strongly drawn towards the idea of natural barriers and how good, particularly really high alpine, so places like the Southern Alps, in terms of stopping things going east to west or west to east, and then also really big rivers in terms of slowing down the invasion rate to something that is manageable. And so that's quite an important criteria there that I just want to re-emphasize, which is that success for a barrier is not 100%. I think it's completely unrealistic to have a 100% proof barrier. What we're trying to do is understand how good are they at slowing down invasion such that your detection system in behind is able to pick them up to give you a chance of nailing them before you have a population re-established. So one of the little pieces of work I wanted to highlight is some of the work looking at the barriers that we've got down in our field site in South Westland. Don't mind the crazy little red oval. That is an artifact of the technology we're working with, and Nick was unable to figure out how to get it off the screen, so it'll make sense shortly. But the field site we're working in is that black hashed polygon. That's what we call the Perth Valley. As you can see, it's inland from Whataroa on the west coast of the South Island. So what we wanted to understand was, given that we are looking at a site that is bordered by Southern Alps and a couple of really big rivers, namely the Perth River and the Butler River, we wanted to understand how good are they going to be at particularly keeping rats out. And so where that oval is now, we set up a little trial, just taking a sample of the river where we chose what we thought to be probably the easiest place for a rat to cross. It was the slowest flowing part of it, which to be fair is still pretty quick. But here we designed our trial to take a look at the crossing rate of rat swarming. So on one side, where you can now see the pink dots on the map, is where we set up our automated lure dispenser. So that's the picture on the top left-hand corner, where you have the syringe with what looks like pink goo inside. So this lure dispenser is something that we've developed. To be honest, it's nothing more glamorous than a medical grade syringe filled with food product. In this case, it's egg mayonnaise. And then it has a motor on the top, which is set to slowly dispense a small amount by just turning the syringe each night. So you get a small amount of the lure underneath it, as you can see in that little squiggle. And inside the mayonnaise is rhodamine B, which is a biomarker. So when rats eat it, it's metabolized and it's left as a small band of fluorescence in their whiskers. And then when you catch the animal, you can look at those whiskers under a UV microscope and tell whether or not it's eaten it. On the same side as the river, we set up a low labor device. So we set up the A24 good natured trap with the Weka excluder, which is the coil you see. And that's because obviously our field site is on the west coast. So it is in Kia country. So we needed to make the good natured trap Kia safe, and the Department of Conservation recognised the Weka excluder as a Kia safe attachment. And the idea there was to effectively assist the river. So use the good nature device to effectively harvest the rats coming against the river to take off some of that pressure of a full population of rats wanting to swim across that river. And then on the opposite side of that river, we set up a whole lot of Doc 200s. And that's what those blue dots are, directly opposite where we're doing our biomarking. And again, we put a lure dispenser on the top of that trap so that we didn't have to keep servicing the traps as often. And effectively, then we just spent months and months feeding the rats on the one side and constantly looking at the traps on the other side to see what we'd catch. So we ran the trial from August last year till March this year. So it was around about 7 months. We ended it in March because that's when we undertook the removal operation inside the Perth Valley site. And so during the trial period, we caught 169 rats in that 4K stretch on the inside of the river. And the headline result is that we had one rat cross the river in that 7-month period. And so that is the band of whisker that we identified under the microscope. So that's kind of what the rhodamine bee looks like when you see it. And that little cross is the exact point at which we caught the rat. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the point it crossed at, but that's where we picked it up on the other side. And so when we did the numbers on that, and people who are a lot cleverer than me in terms of stats did those numbers, we basically came up with a range that we felt meant that it probably is an invasion rate that, so long as our detection is effective and sensitive, we can probably manage that flow of rats into the field site. And so in the last year or so, the site has been running somewhat predator-free in terms of, it's been a year since we ran the initial removal operation, and we are yet to have clearly identified any rats having invaded the site yet, because across all of the river boundary now, which is about 20k long, we've got the same setup. So we've got A24s and biomarking ALDs trying to mark any rats so that we could understand whether the rats we still had in sight were survivors or invaders. For those who have been staring intently at the map, you will have noticed that there is a bridge from the outside of the site to the inside of the site. We did account for that, and that's where we designed something a little bit odd, I guess, for most people, and that's that we designed a predator gate. So effectively, this is a really, really small predator fence with a gate in the middle of it so that people can still cross through it, and it basically operates just like a pulled fence. So it's got the double lock, and it's got springs on it that pull the door back closed in case someone forgets to close it. And it's just been effectively riveted onto the swing bridge itself, far enough off the rest of the landscape so that rats can't get around it, and then with enough overhang that things haven't yet been able to get past it. One of the other barriers, as I mentioned earlier, is predator fencing, and so we've been doing quite an amount of work trying to understand what's the minimum height that we might be able to get away with for predator fencing. So at the moment, most predator fences around the country are 1.8 to 2 meters high, and typically that's due to the fact that most projects are seeking to also exclude feral cats. Given that ZIP's mandate currently is rat, stoat, and possum, we started to do a little bit of investigating about, could that fence come down a lot lower if the cats were taken out of that equation? And so at our research facility down at Lincoln University, we've got a 2-hectare paddock that has a typical predator fence around the outside, but we built a little small cell on the middle of it to just to do a little bit of this testing where we could lift the fence up and down and just see what would go on. And so what we found, surprisingly enough, was that for all species, rats, stoats, and possums, we found that all rats and 95% of possums and stoats were kept in by a fence that was only 1.1 meters high that still had the standard predator capping on top of it. So 1.1 meters high is a standard stock fence, so it's a standard farm height fence. And then obviously the capping is your typical predator capping. And that's where things got a little bit interesting for us. We decided that if this was going to be a technology that could potentially be picked up by New Zealand and rolled out, then we wanted to understand whether we could make improvements in how you productionize and how you build it. There's significant cost in building a predator fence. And so what we've been looking at is can we run piping as the capping system on this fence? Because if we could, then potentially you can run that a little bit like they run it in the factories to make it, and you can also get away from having to cut and weld it, because you'd be able to heat bend it up and down in the round corners, so you could actually get really fast at laying your piping across the top. And so what we did is we modified our small cell, and we ended up with just the front side of it with the fence design in question. And we've trialed a number of different pipe sizes in terms of diameter along that top. And so the first one we tried was the 100mm pipe, which is the one in the top left corner. Initially, it seemed to start doing all right in terms of stoats, but then the first possum we put in there managed to quickly get itself out. So we ended up shelving that design. At that point, Predator Free Wellington got in touch with us to ask us about low height fencing, because they were considering it as an option in conjunction with the airport. And so we started looking at this fence design specifically for rats only, because that was the species in question for Predator Free Wellington. So we thought, given that rats are a smaller animal, potentially we could use a smaller pipe, which is where the 90mm pipe comes in, which is the photo at the bottom of the slide. Unfortunately, 2 of the 16 rats we trialed managed to climb their way out. And it was deemed that 1 of 20 would have been a successful enough rate. However, 2 going in quick succession didn't help things. And so we ended up increasing the pipe diameter by 20mm. And yeah, basically that all but 1 of the rats that we trialed were all kept in the enclosure from the 110mm pipe. And then, because we'd sort of addressed that one for Predator Free Wellington, we went back to testing the fence designs for possums and stoats. And having seen how easily the possum got out of the 100mm pipe, we didn't even bother with the 110 and went to the 160mm. So at the moment, that design is keeping all animals that we've tested inside. I should say that the diameter of pipe that we're choosing here isn't kind of random. These are pipe diameters that are already made, for water and the like. So we're simply using tech that's already in existence and just trying to come up with another way of using it. And so hence why it's kind of does appear to randomly jump around in terms of sizes, but that's just how these things come off the shelf. One of the challenges that got posed to us quite early on when we started looking at fences was the idea of, how do we defend a deliberate opening in a fence? So within about 6 months of Zip getting started in early 2015, 6 of New Zealand's dairy companies poked some investment into Zip, looking at a few specific challenges for them, and one of which was they're really interested in predator fencing all of their milk factories so that they can get away from having to run pest control on the inside of them. But when you have a milk factory of someone like Fonterra, where you have your front gate pretty much open all day long because trucks are coming in and out, taking milk in or taking milk out, how do you defend that deliberate opening? And so we modified the 2-hectare enclosure that we have in Lincoln, and we built a central fence, basically cutting it in half, and left that kind of gap in the middle of it, and started to explore a few ideas about how we might defend it. And so this idea here is an electric grid. It's a little bit like a cattle stop. And so we took this idea from some work that had been done in the Channel Tunnel, looking at electrification as a deterrent, and we modified the design to be more applicable to animals, rats, stoats, and possums. And then we released them on one side, turned on the electric grid, which is just running an electric fence type system, and then had a whole lot of cameras set up watching the grid to see what would happen. And so I'm just going to get Nick to play this video, and you'll be able to see what happens to a possum who approaches the grid. So as you'll see there, that's the possum getting a pretty decent whack on the hand from the electrics. We trialled this on 11 different possums, and all 11 were deterred by the grid and didn't take it on after getting an initial shock. So we were starting to feel pretty confident about the design and decided to bring other target species into the mix. And so the next one we tested was stoats. And it's fair to say this was less successful, as you'll see. And so what you see there is due to the stoat's slightly smaller size and the fact that it can get a reasonable way onto the grid, we found that once it's electrocuted, it was somewhat random as to whether it sprung forward or back. So in the example that I just showed, it springs forward. Unfortunately, we had 3 of 5 stoats all spring forward that we tested, and so we are reasonably confident that it's not all that effective on a stoat. We did also test it on rats, but again, it was not anywhere near as successful for rats, and we think that's due to the design. Currently, the design has quite decent sized bars that are hollow that act as the grid, and so we think that rats can get a long way along all of the bars individually without being able to join the earth and live wires together and get the zap. And so in order for us to take this forward with rats, we think we'd need quite a decent redesign of the grid itself. I just want to quickly touch on one thing that's kind of a major part of defending a site, and that is being able to measure how well you're working. And so if my kind of one piece of advice, I guess, of this whole talk for anyone who's in any form of predator control work would be, if you're really trying to measure the effectiveness of what you're doing on stoats, then tracking tunnels just simply don't provide that sensitivity. We've done quite a decent amount of work looking at or comparing things like tracking tunnels to cameras, and they just completely are just at really low numbers of stoats. It's really, really hard to get them to go into a tracking tunnel, it seems. Instead, by far and away, the most sensitive detection tool we've discovered thus far is a camera. Ideally, it's a lured camera. I know all of these shots have got our lure dispenser in them. I am not trying to sell you guys anything. This is simply the way we have it set up at the site. I do think luring a camera makes it far more attractive, particularly if you can lure it with a food, because then you typically see repeat visitation, which allows you to then target particular areas with your trapping or whatever your regime may be. But yeah, cameras by a long shot so far have been the most effective thing we've been able to find to measure our success. And then obviously, it's all well and good that you've detected that you've got something in your site. Then what do you do about it? So I just wanted to share a quick story to wrap this up about some of the stuff we've done that hasn't gone to plan. So we had a lot of success at one of our earlier field sites with having a very lightly distributed network of leg hold traps that had remote reporting on them that was able to pick off the 1 or 2 possums that was getting into our site and stop them from being able to find each other and reestablish a population. So it was our intention to run a very similar style of network in our Perth Valley site. Obviously, in that site, there is weka and kia. So we needed to figure out a way in which we could have these traps sitting in the landscape ready for possums, but not catching kia. So we did design something. We designed a little lock system, and I'll get Nick to show you the video now which pretty much shows you very basically how it all works.
Now the yoke has been pulled down and locked, pulling against the back of this extended lever arm on the back of the treadle, it's impossible to set the trap off now.
Yeah, and so we got very confident with how that mechanism worked with our engineers. And so we took them into the field and we decided that we would lock some down permanently and put them up and expose some care to them and see if the same would hold for them. And so I just wanted to show you what a care interaction with one of these locked traps looks like. And so again, as it shows there, we had care walking all over the treadle, not able to set it off. And so we started feeling pretty good, thinking that this would be something that would work. We'd just be able to roll out the same methodology we'd used in a former smaller site, and it would be happy days. The unfortunate thing is that care are pretty good at learning. And so if you leave something out there long enough for them, they'll play around with it long enough to give you a new problem. And so what we started to see with the traps after we left them out for about 4 months was this kind of thing. And so on the leg holds that we use, we've obviously got the chain to keep the trap in place once it's caught the animal and it's jumped off the platform. And that's also got a small section of bungee, which is to slow down the jerk on the chain when the possum jumps off. That bungee seems to be particularly attractive to care, who like to untie it and nibble on the ends of it. And they started to do everything they could to get onto that. So they would flick the front arm of the trap trap forward, which meant you no longer could catch anything inside. And then they would get at the chain and get at the bungee, basically making it ineffective to be able to catch anything useful. So we've done a whole lot of R&D getting to that point. And the new plan now, given that we've seen it's taken care a little bit of time, has been that we've taken all of these out of the site. And our response now is all based around cameras. So the cameras are working so well for us that we believe, given that we've got a field team of 9 in site, that we're able to get around those cameras fast enough to pick up possum detections and then deploy a small network of these locked traps around that particular site to target those animals. And then once we've caught the possum, then we pull the gear out again to minimize that learning opportunity for the care and maximize our chances of nailing the possum. So I just wanted to share that little story so that you don't get the impression that everything we've done has worked out all that well, because I've given you very much the Reader's Digest version of some of the stuff we've done up to this point.
I'm going to now go back and just to some questions that have come up during your presentation. First, thanks very much. It's great, great presentation. And I'll just go what camera brand and model do you recommend? That's interesting.
So all of the cameras we use now are the Browning's Dark Ops. We find that their image quality's been the best. We are actually working on a small guideline around how we set them up, and we'll put that up on our website so that others ideally can kind of learn all the mistakes that we've done and hopefully not repeat them themselves.
Here's another one from Catherine. Hi, Phil. Have you trialed the fence models in an area that borders forest?
At the moment, we haven't had any. We haven't actually trialed the fence outside of the pen. Predator-free Wellington decided against going with the fence option and went with the virtual barrier option in the Wellington airport setup. And we haven't had any other projects that have yet been keen on picking up the tech to roll it out yet. So not yet.
Just one I've seen come through from Jeff, who must have come into the presentation a bit later. Could you just remind people that stoat that we saw getting shocked and taking off? Can you just explain what the video was about for Chris? Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So one of the challenges we were asked in some of our early work around predator fencing was, how would you defend a deliberate opening, say where you had a road or a gate that needed to be open lots of the time? And we looked at trying to design that electric grid. So effectively that's an electric cattle stop, for lack of a better way to describe it. And we simply let animals go on one side and encouraged them with food on the other side for them to take it on, and then recorded what they did. And that's one of the recordings that effectively showed that a stoat can get quite a long way onto the grid before it starts to get shocked. And then it's random as to whether it springs forward or back. And unfortunately, in the 5 trials we did, 3 of them sprung forward, which is, not a great success rate by anyone's measurement.
Thanks for explaining that. Thanks, Chris. What's in that egg mayonnaise, please? Because some people are looking for a lure. Those ones are Best Foods mayonnaise. So the food stuff you buy in the supermarket, or maybe you don't buy it in the supermarket because it's all sold out at the moment. But yeah, that's a food grade Best Foods mayonnaise. It's the mayonnaise that we've found had the highest egg content of anything on the shelf. And so we just buy that in ginormous buckets, and then members of our team are filling syringes flat out for us. Jenny asks how many rats were caught in the good nature traps.
As with most people using good nature traps, we haven't been counting. It's not a number we needed to know. We did do a small amount of index trapping with snap traps so that we could be confident around the level of biomarker uptake that was happening around those ALDs, around the lure dispensers. And we were catching, we caught 50 rats in sort of 3 nights early on before the A24s were live. And then when we came back to do it again, we caught 11 about 6 weeks later. So whether that's telling you the A24s are catching and keeping them down or not, I don't really know. And that wasn't really part of what we were trying to do. They were there simply to help take the pressure off so that we had less coming over the river at us.
Joe asks, how would the grid go with cats?
I honestly don't know. I suspect there could be a combination of the possum and the stoat outcome. They're reasonable sized animals, so potentially they'd get zapped before they've put themselves too far on. But maybe they would spring forward and then keep springing forward. It's hard to know. We haven't done that yet, and we currently don't have the. They're not part of our target suite, so they're not on the list to be tested yet.
Shane asks, any work on weasels, which are significantly more prevalent in the southwestern North Island than stoats?
Not currently. So we have yet to see a weasel in our site, and so we haven't really had to worry about targeting them. Likewise, we've not seen Norway rats, so we haven't done anything specifically targeting them either.
Here's one from Paul saying, have you tried hair tubes for measuring stoats?
Not ourselves. We do know that historically with that, and also that the predator-free mahia guys have been having a bit of success around using hair traps to tell them what's been taking bait and the like. I mean, for me, it's a question of reward versus amount of labour that goes into it and the objective. And so for me, the camera network has been around about the right balance for now in terms of the amount of resource it takes, but also the reward you get in terms of how sensitive it is. Because your stoat doesn't need to do anything but walk in front of the camera. It doesn't need to go into a trap or into a box or into anything. It just needs to walk past and get its photo taken.
From Gay, have you tried the automatic dispensing lure in a Spitfire-style tunnel for stoats?
Not in a Spitfire tunnel, but we have got it on top of trap boxes in the Perth. So on top of Dr. 100 trap boxes and another trap boxes. So that is the equivalent. I mean, it's on top of a box and it is catching stoats. So that map I had up from the Perth River trial, one thing I forgot to mention was also that the green dots on that map were 20 stoats that were also caught in the Doc 200 traps during that same 7-month period on the same stuff. So on the Ignanes lured with our lure dispenser.
Here's another. Have you trialled dogs for detection work?
Yeah, so we have 2 dogs. So we 2 of our field rangers, one of them has a possum detection dog and the other has a rat dog. So they are definitely part of the mix, and they are hugely powerful, no doubt about it.
I see one from Joe just came in. Have you experimented with mirrors and stoat traps?
A tiny amount, because when we first started this program while we were still in doc, one of the first pieces of work that the team did a review of lures, what was known at the time, and one of the cases they found sort of hinted at this idea of mirrors. So we trialed it very, very briefly and in a very small scale, and it's fair to say it wasn't a resounding success, and so we kind of stopped there and moved on.
Lots of questions for you today. That's great. Richard says, asks, it is good. What research have you done on mountain barriers, or is PF 2050 doing that?
So in terms of specific projects around it, I guess our site sits underneath the Southern Alps and our detection network goes throughout the site. So we would strongly, we'd probably kick off work if we had indication that the mountain was the breach. Currently, we've got no indication that stuff's coming up and over the top. We are aware and have had some connection with the work going on in the Team Manahuna Aoraki project on the east side, where Nick Foster's been doing a whole lot of work around the altitude that various animals go to and cover. And so that's starting to inform a reasonable amount of thinking, particularly on that eastern side, that predators do seem to go a lot higher than what was probably originally assumed.
Here's one from Jeff. Is the range of a possum known well enough to be able to trust the grid size of the leg hold traps?
So I wouldn't say it's known well enough. I think because remember, we're talking about very few possums left in a landscape. So I think what we're learning and what others before us, Manaki Whenua doing a lot of work with TB Free New Zealand has shown is when you get possums down to very low levels, those ranges start to really move, or at least maybe not the home range, but at least their roaming behavior moves. And so they are covering areas, easily 50 to 100 hectares in some of the studies that Manaki Whenua did. And we definitely saw those sorts of movements at our small field site in the Marlborough Sounds. And again, it looks like we're seeing it with the 1 or 2 possums that we've got walking around the Perth, going from camera to camera.
Sue asks, if stoats won't use tracking tunnels, why will they enter the tunnel box style trap?
So again, I'm arguing that I'm not convinced they are. And so again, when we're talking about really low numbers of stoats and targeting the 1 or 2 that get back in, or the 1 or 2 that remain, I strongly advocate for the less interaction we can get those animals to do, the better. And I'm not convinced we've got that solved yet. So we've still got very much on our radar what does response look like for those kinds of animals.
Here's one here from John Parker, what's your opinion of the best traps for catching rats? Pretty straightforward question.
Yeah, it is a straightforward question, but doesn't have a straightforward answer. It all depends on your situation. It's very hard to just give a general answer to what's the best trap ever, because there's always local context that dictates stuff, you know. So, I mean, in my backyard right now, I have a Victor snap trap, but in the Perth Valley, we've got Dock 200s. For a case like we've got on the other side of the Perth River, where we don't want to be going to traps a lot of the time because it's hard for our team to get through that terrain, we've got A24s, and so yeah, I think you've got to kind of pick your horse for your course.
From someone here, it's hi Phil, have you detected any cats in your protected areas?
Have we what? Sorry.
Detected any cats?
Oh, cat? Nah, we haven't detected any cats in our Perth Valley site, and we've been looking with cameras for the best part of 18 months now.
Here's one from Michelle. Hi Phil, your natural barriers river, she's put, look promising. However, a fairly well-fed bunch of rats on the untrapped side wouldn't bother crossing. How or would this factor into your trap catch data on the other side?
Yeah, so the what I should have said before is that we'd done no control work on the Dock 200 side of the river before we started that. So the 169 we were catching, other than the one with the rhodamine in it, are no doubt the ones from that side. Anyway, to be honest, if a well-fed population of rats doesn't want to take on the river, then it makes me think maybe we should supplementary feed them on that side that we wanted to keep them on. And so, to me, again, I wasn't so concerned around what was happening on the side of where the rats were coming from. I was more concerned around how many of those were taking on that river and wanting to cross it. And so, yeah, it is, you know, that those conditions could easily have accounted for why we didn't have much crossing going on at that time, no doubt.
Tim Johnson, quite a specific question. So if we had an area of land that we would like to protect, is there much to lose by erecting a 1.1 metre fence with 160 millimetre piping? No,
probably not. I mean, all we've got is what we've tested so far. So I guess the only caveat on my answer is that we've had a very small amount of testing on it. So, you know, someone taking it on and having a crack and having a look at it, see if it holds, is go for it. I mean, the ideas aren't only ours, so by all means, take them and run.
Good. Here's one from Dan. Phil, is there any one recent development in this predator-free scene that excites you the most, either a zip tool or any other? So what's really getting you going?
Artificial intelligence. So that is the thing that will unlock a whole lot of this challenge. So for us, that's image recognition on a camera detection system that's under development. And then from there, arguably that AI platform potentially starts to open up avenues around triggering things that require minimum interaction and various other things. So artificial intelligence is the thing that excites me the most. Yeah.
Great answer. Tim asks, have you done any trialling with the AT220?
No, not yet. We are interested in it. Again, a little bit like the A24 on the outside of the block. You know, it potentially offers an avenue to have a relatively low labour possum tool in the same sort of vein. So, yeah, we're interested in watching how that development keeps evolving.
One from Wit. Do you know if good nature self-resetting traps are 100% safe in use in Kia habitat with a parrot excluder?
I have no experience with the parrot excluder, under the assumption that you're referring to the one I've developed, specifically being named the parrot excluder. My understanding is that they're in discussions with the department around its use in Kia country. So I can't provide any great answer on that. I'm sorry.
I'm going to get Bex, who sends me the questions on my Facebook page, to put maybe one final question if I've missed any. But to you, what motivates you to keep going like you do? You know, I know it's a job for you, but words of advice and how to keep motivated is always good in these kind of times.
I mean, yeah, like I'm motivated by the possibility of what's coming. So everything that we are all doing is creating that. So I'm a massive believer that predator-free New Zealand, you know, is a matter of years away. Like I have no reason to think we can't do that. And it's this kind of thing that helps fuel that. It's seeing the chat box go crazy, admittedly probably going a little too crazy on it's got no sound, it's got no this, it's got no that, but still there's people engaged in listening to this stuff, and having talked to Jesse and Beck about, you know, the interest in these seminars, the interest in what's going on, the amount of work that's going on. That's why we do what we're doing, is because we know that there's a community of adopters kind of waiting. And so all we're trying to do is keep that production line of tools going, so that, you know, as the next challenge comes along, we've got the likes of us and many others willing to take it on, and then all of New Zealand willing to pick it up and get it going. And, you know, the cool thing is, you know, my young kids are going to be growing up in a New Zealand that's different from mine, you know, and it's cool that it's going to be different in a good way, because lots of time we hear about how different it's going to be in a bad way. So this is our chance to have a crack at it for good. And my advice is just keep going.
Thanks a lot. It's been great to have you, Phil, and back to just have a cup of coffee and settle in with a good Netflix movie or something.
Cheers, Nick.
Bye-bye. See you, everybody. See you next time.